By the year 2147, masculinity had become a historical curiosity. It was taught in schools in the same way they taught the plague, steam engines, and arranged marriage, as an unfortunate phase through which civilization had once passed. Children learned that men had once been expected to be strong, competitive, protective, and willing to endure hardship. They learned that men had built bridges, sailed into storms, explored deserts, and volunteered for wars. Then came the correction. The old society, the textbooks explained, had been dangerously obsessed with dominance. So the virtues were carefully redistributed. Strength became aggression. Courage became recklessness. Leadership became authoritarianism. Stoicism became emotional repression. Ambition became toxic competition. Protection became patriarchal control. Within 3 generations, the words themselves had become embarrassing. Nobody was supposed to be strong. Everyone was supposed to be safe. Nobody was supposed to command. Everyone was supposed to negotiate. Nobody was supposed to sacrifice themselves. Everyone was supposed to protect their own boundaries. It sounded wonderful. For a while, it was. Then something strange happened. The worst parts remained. The gossip, the social manoeuvring, the obsession with status, the exclusion of outsiders, the hunger for approval, the quiet cruelty of cliques, the competition disguised as cooperation, the weaponization of tears, the ability to destroy someone socially without ever raising a hand. Those things survived perfectly well. The virtues did not. The society became exquisitely sensitive and remarkably fragile. There were committees for everything. Committees to determine whether committees created sufficient emotional safety. There were tribunals for inappropriate tone. There were public apologies for insufficient empathy. People spent enormous amounts of time discussing how difficult things felt, and almost none discussing what needed to be done. And then the storms came. Not metaphorical storms, actual ones. The northern seawalls failed first. Then the food distribution network collapsed. Then the power grid began failing for weeks at a time. The government announced that citizens should remain calm. 1,000 committees met to discuss resilience. Nobody had any. That was when Mara found the photograph. It was hidden inside a wall of the abandoned Central Archive. She was a junior historian, 26 years old, and had spent her career studying the mistakes of dead men. The photograph showed 12 people standing beside a half-built bridge. 11 men, 1 woman. They were filthy. Their clothes were torn. One man had a bandage around his head. Another was laughing. They looked exhausted. They also looked happy. Mara stared at them for a long time. She couldn't explain the feeling the photograph produced. It wasn't admiration. Admiration was discouraged. It wasn't envy. Envy was considered psychologically unhealthy. It was something more disturbing. She wanted to be there. She wanted to know what it felt like to be one of those people. Not protected, not reassured, needed. She took the photograph home. That night, the power failed. The following morning, the city was dark. By noon, the emergency broadcasts had stopped. By evening, Mara's building was beginning to panic. People shouted in corridors. Someone demanded that the building manager provide emotional support. Someone else demanded an emergency meeting. Mara walked downstairs. In the lobby, 30 frightened people stood around arguing about responsibility. Nobody moved. Then an old woman looked at Mara. "Do you know how to fix the generator?" "No." "Do you know anyone who does?" "No." The woman looked around the room. Nobody did. Mara remembered the photograph. Then she heard herself say, "We're going to find out." Everyone stared at her. "You can't tell us what to do," someone said. Mara swallowed. She had never told anyone what to do in her life. "I know." "Then what are you doing?" She looked at the dark staircase. "Doing it." She walked outside. For the first time in her life, Mara understood why people had once admired men. Not because men had been better. They hadn't. They had been cruel sometimes, foolish, proud, violent, cowardly. But some had possessed something her civilization had forgotten was valuable: the willingness to stand between danger and someone else. The willingness to carry the heavy thing. The willingness to say, "Follow me." Not because they were certain, because someone had to go first. Mara found the generator. She found the maintenance manual. She found 3 people who knew enough to help. They worked through the night. By dawn, the lights came back on. Nobody applauded. There was no ceremony. A little boy simply looked at Mara and asked, "Are you the leader?" Mara almost corrected him. Then she remembered the photograph. "No," she said. She looked around at the exhausted people working beside her. "I'm just the one who went first." Years later, historians would call it the beginning of the Restoration. They would argue endlessly about whether masculinity had really returned. It hadn't. Not exactly. Something better had. People began rediscovering qualities their civilization had abandoned because they had once been associated with men. Courage, discipline, responsibility, sacrifice, competence, protectiveness. The ability to endure pain without making it somebody else's responsibility. The willingness to build something that might outlive you. And slowly, society learned an uncomfortable truth. The answer had never been to replace masculinity with femininity, nor femininity with masculinity. The disaster had been choosing the worst of one while throwing away the best of the other. Human beings needed tenderness, but they also needed toughness. They needed compassion, but they also needed courage. They needed people who could comfort the frightened and people who could walk into the fire. Sometimes the same person had to do both. The final entry in Mara's diary was written 40 years later. She had become an old woman. The photograph still sat on her desk. Beneath it, she had written 4 words. "We forgot what men were." Then, beneath that, "We forgot what we could be." She closed the diary. Outside, children were playing in the street. One little boy fell. He began to cry. His older sister ran toward him. She didn't tell him that falling was unacceptable. She didn't tell him that his feelings were valid. She didn't summon a committee. She simply picked him up. "Come on," she said. We've got work to do. And he got up